Eccoci ragazzi, ben ritrovati in questo nuovo episodio di Performance Talks. Oggi io e Andrea abbiamo l'onore di avere qui con noi Paul Comfort. Welcome in our podcast.
Welcome.
It's a real pleasure to have you in our podcast. So we can start with the first question. Can you please give us an introduction about yourself so our listener know who you are, please? Thank you.
Yep, no problem. So I'm Dr. Paul Comfort. I'm a reader in strength and conditioning at the University of Salford. I've been working in strength and conditioning now for well over 20 years. The academic side of things, almost 20 years. My background really started off in strength and conditioning before strength and conditioning was established in the UK, so way before the UK Strength and Conditioning Association was established. From reading through a whole load of sort of bodybuilding type books, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding, those sorts of things. That was the only literature available, muscle and fitness magazines, and then stumbled across the essentials of strength training and conditioning from the National Strength and Conditioning Association. At that time, I was working as a personal trainer, but working with primarily athletes. But like I said, there was no strength and conditioning as a title or a qualification in the UK at that point. So I was doing that for quite a while, and then went through my education, undergraduate, master's degree, got a job in a university, and then from there progressed on to do my PhD. And I've been at Salford now for almost 13 years. So it was definitely a good move when I moved to the university. We've got great links with a whole range of different football, rugby league, rugby union teams in the area. So most of my time now is spent either teaching for about 50% of the time, or the other 50% of the time is working more in the research capacity and liaising with different clubs that we've got partnerships with.
Okay, perfect. So let's begin with the first question, like the real question. We saw your presentation for the UK SCA on the topic of the power development and how to address power. Therefore, I would like to ask you, what's your belief in regards of power training, and what does it mean that, and especially is that power training the most important quality for sport performance, or is rather, let's say, rate force development?
That's a big question. So if I go off on the tangent, please stop me. So I think if I start with, is it the most important thing? No, definitely not. If you think about the basic biomechanical principles, it's impulse, which is the most important thing. So force times time. So rate of force development is really, really interesting, but you can have a high rate of force development, but actually not produce much force. So we've seen it with a few athletes with, if you look at certain tasks, drop jumps as an example, they land quite stiff, get a really high rate of force development, not necessarily producing much force over much time, and therefore their jump performance on that drop jump is really poor. But if you actually measure rate of force development, it's high because they landed with a stiff strategy. If you then look at that in terms of there's a high force but a very short duration, your impulse might not be particularly high. And if the impulse isn't particularly high, you don't jump particularly high. So we need a trade-off between how much force we can produce and how long we can produce that over. And if you think about a whole range of different sporting tasks, something like powerlifting is relatively easy to train for. You have to get strong. So obviously the name powerlifting is probably incorrect because it's not about power, it's about strength and force production. But you don't have a time limit on how long it takes you to perform that repetition, as long as the barbell keeps moving. So you could take 4 or 5 seconds to perform a lift. So you'd have a huge force, but the rate of force development would be very low, would be relatively low. If you look at other sports like weightlifting, obviously it's a much more rapid movement, but it's still not really constrained by time. That's more to do with your proportions, how long the lift might take. But when we're looking at most sporting tasks, running, jumping, etc., even if you look at running, if you're going from a standing start, the first couple of strides, you might have 400 or 500 milliseconds as a contact time. That's quite a long duration. Once you get up to top speed, you'll be down at 100 milliseconds or sometimes less with really elite sprinters. But to continue to accelerate, we have to produce a high impulse. So we've got to produce those really high forces in those short durations to continue accelerating. Now that does underpin power output. It does underpin rate of force development, but there are some sort of subtleties, like I said, that you could have a high rate of force development, but not actually be producing a particularly high force. You're just producing that force very rapidly. And therefore, that's probably not great for performance. But what underpins all of that is strength. And the stronger we can get our athletes, but it's got to be relative strength. It's no good just getting stronger and stronger and putting on more and more mass. You have to have a disproportionate increase in strength for any increase in muscle mass that you gain. So that underpins our ability to generate a high rate of force development or a high impulse, because the more force we can produce, the more potential there is to produce a high force in a shorter duration. And there's a whole load of studies out there, some of them single joint. We've looked at just isometric knee extension. And if you increase knee extension force isometrically, you also produce knee extension force in those earlier time periods. The problem is some of the studies where you look and find that as someone's done a high volume strength training program, that at the end of that, they're not improving their performance. Well, that's not really surprising, because if you've done a high volume of strength training, you'll have some residual fatigue. So at that point, if you test them at the end of a 4, 6, or 8 week strength training block, they will still be fatigued. Wait a few weeks, test them later when they've unloaded and done a lower volume of the strength training. And actually, you've super compensated. You've recovered from those high volumes of training. And then you find rate of force development or force at 100, 200 milliseconds, etc., is dramatically increased. And we've got a couple of studies where we've shown that with the isometric mid-thigh pull. And we've got a few others that we're working on at the moment where if you increase maximum strength, so your peak force during an isometric mid-thigh pull, no matter what that training modality is, whether it's maximum strength training, whether it's more power development, if peak force goes up, your force at 100, 200 milliseconds also increases. And that's what we really need. And for most people, it does depend on their sport, but most people aren't what we would really class as strong. Most people, we could easily get stronger. If you look at a lot of football players, soccer players in the UK, they have fantastic sprint performances and fantastic jump performances, but they don't do much strength training. They're not strong. Not in sort of the real terms of the word strong and how strong you can really get. And I'm not comparing them to power lifters or weightlifters, but even compared to other multiple sprint sport athletes. So for them to improve power, loads and loads of plyometric training, loads of sprint training, etc., they don't improve much because they're already very efficient at using the force they can produce. The only way for them to really improve is to increase their force production capacity, because they're using the force they can already produce optimally. If you look at the reverse of that, if you look at rugby players, especially the forwards, they're generally very, very strong, but they can't always produce the force as rapidly as possible. They generally won't do a lot of sort of explosive plyometric type training. It's all high load, which makes sense if it's rugby union because the scrum is obviously a low velocity. But what we also need to be able to get them to do is really focus on producing that force as quickly as possible. And in some cases, also considering things like, is the easiest way to increase their relative strength to drop some body fat in some cases. However, you've also got to bear in mind that some of those forwards in a rugby team, we want maximum momentum. So even though you might not get top running speed, because we need to look at both speed and mass to give us momentum, if you've got an athlete who is basically the wrecking ball of the team and just runs through people to gain an extra 10, 15 yards, we probably don't want them to lose mass. Whereas for other people, losing mass might be the easiest way of increasing their power output and their jump performance. If any of us put on a weighted vest weighing 20 kilos and jump, our jump height goes down and our power output goes down because it's harder to accelerate a greater mass. So there's a huge amount of things to consider. I think overall, the main thing is we need to optimize strength. We need to get people as strong as is required for their sport, and we need to regularly evaluate whether strength is a limiting factor or whether the ability to express force rapidly is the limiting factor. So that sort of comes back to making sure at the end of each training phase, you do appropriate testing and monitoring of those athletes to see, did you get the desired training effect? And whatever you've planned for your next training phase, is that still what you should be still training for? Or has that changed? Did we get a completely different adaptive response? Because everyone's individual. So if we're looking at power, if we increase strength, you become more powerful. But it's not necessarily about training at loads that optimize power all the time. So some of the research I did early on was looking at the load that optimizes power output during a power clean or a hang power clean. But actually, if you look at all the research, training at that load doesn't necessarily make you more powerful. It makes you really efficient at using that load, but it doesn't necessarily transfer to other tasks and other activities. So what we really need to be focusing on is, does the athlete need to focus on the movement velocity and the ability to produce force very, very rapidly? Or do they need to be focusing on increasing that ceiling, so getting their strength level to increase and increasing relative strength? And then you probably just move back and forth between those two, with one period of time with an emphasis more on strength. That doesn't mean you stop the high velocity movements. You just do a little bit less of them. You decrease the emphasis. And then another phase where you'll decrease the emphasis on strength and focus more on the higher velocity movements, lower load type tasks. And that's going through the entire spectrum, whether that's plyometric tasks, whether it's weightlifting type tasks with a range of different loads, but you still need some heavy load strength training in there. Only a small amount, just to maintain that strength that you've got up to. If you did a block of strength training with traditional squats, Romanian deadlifts, lunges, split squats, those sorts of things, and then stopped for 6 weeks and just did plyometrics, you'll lose force production capability. So there should always be a little bit of each of those different components in your training, but it's really a case of making sure that you emphasize the correct aspect of it. Because the thing that underpins acceleration is how much force we can produce within a given time.
Perfect. So, correct me if I'm wrong. The purpose of a testing is actually to determine what kind of aim of the training session will be in the next block or whatever, and therefore there must be some sort of baseline level of each individual qualities that must be keep on working on. Is that right?
Yeah, that's completely correct. So we generally will use things like an isometric mid-thigh pull to assess maximum force generation capacity and get peak force. And we can also then get force at early time points, 150, 200, 250 milliseconds. And then you can look at how much of that force they can express. So, at 150 milliseconds, are they expressing 50 or 60% of their peak force, which occurs after around about a second or so? If they're expressing a large percentage of that peak force early on, they're probably quite efficient at producing that force rapidly. Some people, though, you find at 100 milliseconds, they're only producing about 35% of their peak force. So we know then they need to work more on the ability to produce force rapidly. The other thing that we do alongside that is look at something like a counter movement jump and use dynamic strength index. So you might see it referred to as dynamic strength deficit, and look at the ratio between the amount of force they can produce isometrically and the amount of force they can produce during a counter movement jump. And if you can express 80% of your isometric force during that dynamic task, then you need to increase your maximum force generating capacity. If you're down below 60%, we need to emphasize the ability to produce force as quickly as we can, because we can only produce 60% of that maximum isometric force during a dynamic task. The key thing with that, though, is we have to make sure that we cue the athlete in exactly the same way with both those tests. So it's to jump as high as you can when you're jumping. So it's a real jump. They're not changing their strategy, which could affect the forces. And then you're cueing them to push as fast and hard as possible during the isometric mid-thigh pull. And that gives us a really good indication of how whether they need to focus more on maximum strength or whether they need to focus more on the ability to produce force rapidly in a dynamic nature. At the same time, though, even if you're producing 50% of your peak force or isometric peak force during a jump, that would normally indicate we need to focus on more ballistic, plyometric type training. But if they're really, really weak, we don't worry about that. We just need to get them stronger. So if they can only produce something like 20 newtons per kilogram, I can probably do that stood on one leg, and I'm in my 40s and I'm not an athlete. So when you've got athletes that are really weak, we need to actually get them stronger first. So you've got to take that into context. You can't just look at a ratio on its own. We've really got to also identify the components of those ratios. And that's the same for any ratio measurement that we might look at. You can't just look at the ratio and say, oh, it gives me this figure. We have to look at both of those components to really make an informed decision. And there are alternative ways of doing that. You know, JB Moran and a range of other people focus on force velocity profiling, doing squat jumps with a range of different loads and looking at the rate of decline in velocity with an increase in load. That works quite well. From my point of view, I don't generally use that because it's much quicker for me to get people to do 3 counter movement jumps on a force plate, 3 maximum efforts on an isometric mid-thigh pull, get a load of additional data in terms of the strategy for jumping, the forces that they're producing in those early time points, and it's really quick and efficient. We can get through a squad of 25, 30 athletes with a decent set of force plates where it's automated, and we can get through that and have our data in about an hour if we've got 2 sets of force plates. So but yes, you have to monitor that regularly to identify, by regularly at the end of each training phase, to identify if you really had the adaptations you hoped you would get, and then also to make sure we're really training for the right physical characteristic in our next training phase.
Okay, so may I ask you another question? But in this regard, so you just said basically if there's a hypothetical athletes that got like a good expression of like counter movement jump, you don't actually focus on it because probably is that because like the sport itself improve the capacity of like the elastic component of it, therefore maybe it just needs some more strength related.
Yeah, potentially. And obviously it depends on the sport to some extent and the athlete, but it's really easy to embed plyometric and ballistic jump training into an athlete's program. If they're full-time professional athletes, they'll warm up before a gym session. You can get them doing a few jumps. They'll warm up before every pitch session and before any conditioning session if they're doing those separately, or court session if it's a court-based sport. So actually you can get a lot of good quality jumping in during those warm-ups, and that's really, really useful for injury prevention and to help improve landing mechanics as well. But if you're looking at a sport where there is a huge amount of jumping, if you're looking at volleyball, netball, basketball, they're already jumping a lot. So do we really need to get them doing a lot of additional jump training? Probably not, because of the amount of impacts they're going through on a daily basis in practice and competition. If they can't land effectively, yes, we definitely need to reduce that risk of injury. But if we do use ballistic or plyometric training, it needs to be really high quality and low volumes. We need to be challenging them beyond what they would get in their sport. Otherwise, they might as well just be playing their sport, and we've got no progressive overload then.
Yes, precisely. So we can even say that strength training might be like a good option to develop a good amount of eccentric strength, and therefore like even progress somehow in the direction of like a better landing mechanic and whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with that it's interesting because there is a little bit of research showing that if you make athletes stronger, they naturally improve their landing mechanics. If you get somebody to drop off a 50 centimeter box and they're weak, they'll either land with a really poor technique or they'll land very stiff. Because they're worried that they can't decelerate it, and we've all done that as children. I can remember jumping off my parents' shed roof and different things like that, landing as a child, not being strong enough, and the next thing you know, you're in a heap on the floor, your knees come up and hit you in the chin, you've bit your tongue. That was because I wasn't strong enough, and actually my stretch reflexes would have worked a completely different way when I was younger. But strength training can really help landing mechanics if athletes are weak. You still need to train them to land appropriately, and we still need to challenge them with those landings, not just dropping off a box and landing normally, land on one leg, rotate, jump, turn 90 degrees, turn 180 degrees, etc. But yeah, actually, if we have identified that the athlete is weak, then the biggest thing we need to do is actually increase their strength. And you see it sometimes with adolescent where you've got a coach who says, we've put it in place until you can do a pistol squat. We're not going to do any loaded strength training. Well, that's ridiculous, because a pistol squat is the same as me. I weigh just over 100 kilos. That's like me putting a 100-kilo barbell on my back and doing a full depth back squat with good enough stability. Well, actually, most individuals struggle. And if I go back to soccer players, there's very few soccer players that I can think of that I've worked with where I could put their body mass on their back, make them squat full depth with good technique and come up from there. And that's probably why a lot of them can't perform a pistol squat either, just because they're weak, or they've got limited range of motion, or they've got poor stability and balance. There's a whole range of factors. But actually, if we want to improve stability and balance, we can get people stronger. We do need to challenge stability at the same time, but the easiest way to challenge that is get them to do a split stance or a unilateral stance. But the more unstable you become, the less force you can generate, and the less force you can generate rapidly because you're unstable. So that's not always the best method of training, is to challenge stability more and more if you're chasing strength. If you're rehabilitating somebody and you're really looking at proprioception, balance, coordination, that's great, because your emphasis isn't strength at that point. It is balance and coordination and proprioception. So then you would do more unstable training. So it's just making sure you're emphasizing the right things at the right time.
Perfect. Is in your opinion, is that maybe the reason why is not in specific sports, there is no like some sort of culture of strength training, and there is not pursue it? It doesn't make sense. Sorry. Is that because of like of the? I'll put it this way. Sorry for my English. It's in our incapacity to precisely give the right information in regards of strength training, because it's some of the time it's always seen as like it's dangerous and whatever. Especially here in Italy, we got like a less culture of strength training than you back in UK. I don't understand the reason why of it, but also because it's a moment of training session where you actually reduce somehow the velocity of the exercise. Therefore, if you do those basic exercises, it's kind of impossible to get injured in it. So
yeah, I think there's a lot of different reasons why it's not adopted. I think it's part of it is cultural. It's based on what people have done in those sports. If you look at a lot of sports, the coaching staff are ex-athletes. So a lot of the judgments that they tend to base their training on is based on what they did previously. For a lot of technical coaches, they haven't got a good education in sports science, strength and conditioning, the underpinning physics and biomechanics and physiology. And there are, a whole load of myths associated with it. As you mentioned, injury risk. You've got a much higher incidence of injury from playing sport, which nobody complains about, than you get from doing something in the weight room. Yes, something can go wrong, but that's actually why you need appropriately qualified professionals to deliver that strength training, who understand how you should coach, can appropriately plan and program for that type of sport and activity. And you also need a really good level of communication between the whole multidisciplinary team. I've seen fantastic examples where that works really well, and fantastic examples where it doesn't work well in a range of different sports at different levels of competition, with males, with females, different age groups. It really doesn't matter. But if you're in an environment, the clubs that tend to do really well and are consistent have a good multidisciplinary team where the coaching staff, the medical staff, the sports science and strength and conditioning staff work really well together and listen to each other, and they have an open communication. And you tend to find that the staff stay there longer as well, and they consistently perform well. That doesn't mean that they couldn't perform things better. And it also doesn't mean that some of the top clubs do it really, really well, because you've also got to think about the fact that some sports teams have so much money, they will always attract the best players. Their sort of sports science and strength and conditioning practices could be awful, not just suboptimal, but awful or non-existent in some cases. I've gone into some clubs where they don't have barbells. So that straight away makes it suboptimal, because you can't load somebody as effectively as you can with a barbell. Yes, there are alternatives. It's not essential to use a barbell, but it would be more, certainly far more optimal than using sandbags and, strongman type apparatus or body weight. So there's a whole range of different issues that you've got. A lot of it is down to education, and it's down to education of athletes, because you'll see a lot of academy level teams where they're doing everything really, really well. And then they go up to the first team, age 18 or 19, they go and play with the first team. See how the first team trains, especially in football, and suddenly go back to the younger age group saying, I don't need to do all of this. They never do it. But again, that doesn't mean that they couldn't get better if they didn't do it. And I've had these discussions numerous times with different people. And sometimes the coaching staff, including the strength coaches, will say, well, actually, our athletes are running 5 meters in 0.95 of a second. They're really quick. They can jump 55, 60 centimeters. They've got a fantastic jump performance. They're really fit aerobically. And I certainly wouldn't dispute that football players are fit aerobically. Most of them are phenomenally fit. But actually, they're very good at sprinting. They're very good at jumping. They're good at changing direction. But could we make them better? And yes, we could. It would be relatively easy for those individuals to make them better. And you see that with youth athletes, and you see it with athletes that will occasionally come up from a lower level of competition. And maybe they're not the most talented player, which is why they haven't made it at a young age. And then in their early 20s, they make it through to the top level of competition just due to work ethic, and they're a phenomenal athlete, but they might not be the best at that sport. What would be nice to see is if you've got somebody in whatever sport it is with the most phenomenal talent and they're trained properly, so they become the most phenomenal athlete, how good would they be? But some people will get by on talent alone. And I think that's part of the problem. If you think about it, if your head coach that you're working with played 15, 20 years ago, and they were very, very talented at playing the sport, but never did any structured strength training, they'll think they don't need to do it. And I think the problem is also that sometimes when we try and implement it, we try and make it the ideal training program, forgetting that that athlete is maybe never ever done any strength training. So we can give them a tiny dose. We could give them 2 sets of squats and 2 sets of Romanian deadlifts. If they've never done that before, even at a really light load, they'll be sore tomorrow. They'll come back and they might say, I'm injured, because they've never experienced soreness like it. And that's part of the problem. So you've got to be really, really cautious with how you implement things. And I know from some of the people I've worked with, from some of my current PhD students as well, who work in a range of different sport settings, when they've moved from one sport to another, they go in with the mindset of what they were doing in their other sport or in a different club. They turn up and it's a completely different culture, and they get part of the way through a training session sometimes and are thinking, wow, these people are really well trained. They're not struggling at all. They're finding this easy. But in other settings, they turn up and have to totally change what they're doing, because after their first 2 exercises, all the athletes are struggling because they're just not used to that type of training. So you've got to be progressive. And I think that's one of the things that people forget about long-term athlete development. Long-term athlete development is not about youth athletes on their own. It's about any athlete, because if I've got an athlete who's 20, comes to play for a team that I'm working with, and they've never done any strength training, I've got to treat them like a 10-year-old in the academy, because they've got no strength training history. I can accelerate them quicker, but I've got to start them right back at the basics. And then I could have somebody who's coming at the age of 16, who's been training for 6 years and is actually outperforming and out-training some of my senior athletes. So you've got to individualize it, and you've got to look at what those athletes are capable of, not just as an athlete in terms of playing their sport, but what's their training history? Can they perform these movements? Have they got good motor control? And again, sometimes they might have a phenomenal sprint, jump, change of direction performance. You put a barbell on their shoulders and their movement is awful. And then you've got to start from the real basics again. And I think because it's been done incorrectly, sometimes that scares people off, or somebody picks up a bit of an injury and that can scare them off. But nobody says, well, you picked up an injury playing sport, stop playing sport. It's a case of, well, why did you pick up that injury doing that exercise? What went wrong? Was it too high a volume of that exercise? Did we progress it too quickly? Was your technique awful? What caused it? But all that tends to happen is that caused the injury, we'll stop doing that, which is not the right way to go about it. a little bit too dramatic. If everyone in the squad got injured, yeah, there's a problem. But again, we've got to identify, is it an injury or is it delayed onset muscle soreness because they're just not used to that exercise? And a good example there, if you look at things like the compliance rates in studies which have used Nordic hamstring exercises, some of them use huge volumes, and there's some protocols out there that recommend 3 sets of 10, which is absolutely ridiculous. I would never, ever attempt to do 3 sets of 10. If I did that with a maximum intent and tried to resist all the way down, probably after 4 or 5 reps, I'm going to be sore. So you've got to start off with a really low volume and build it up progressively. But people don't always do that because, again, Nordic hamstring exercise looks easy. There's no external load. But you wake up the next day and find that it wasn't as easy as you thought. So it's about just being progressive and really thinking about the type of exercise, but also thoroughly educating everyone involved. That's, us as sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches, but everyone around the team. Let them know why you're using certain things. Build it up progressively. And it might take longer to see the results you were hoping for, but nobody should get injured along the way. They should start to enjoy it. It shouldn't be too challenging. They shouldn't be too sore. And you build them up to that point, you can make it challenging.
Perfectly. We feel the same way. So you found some sort of allies in what you just said.
I have a question, Andrea.
Go on.
So you previously talked about the importance of to have a stability to make strength better. So my question is, it is better unilateral or bilateral training?
Okay, well, if you look at the research which is out there, and there's only a couple of studies, it tends to indicate that they're equally as effective in trained individuals. If you've monitored and matched the volumes, but there is specificity in there. If you test the athletes on a bilateral task, those that did bilateral training improve the most in bilateral training. Those that use unilateral training improve the most in those unilateral tasks. But both groups improve in all tasks, but you improve the most in the type of task that you trained. So I don't think it's really a case of, is one better than the other? If we want to maximize strength, force production, velocity of movement, you'll do that acutely by doing a bilateral task. But if we want to challenge stability, which we need to do, you need some split stance exercises and some unilateral exercises. So we need a good combination of both. You think about it, if you've only done back squats or front squats for a while and you go to split squats or lunges, your glutes hurt like hell the next day and your groin might do as well because you've had to stabilize so much more, but the load is probably far less. So you're challenging them more. So you should have a combination of both of those in there. For some sports, powerlifting, weightlifting, you need minimal of that sort of unilateral type of task because you never really do it in your sport. But for team-based sports, whether it's court or whether it's pitch-based sports, you need a good combination of both. And again, we need to change the emphasis at certain times. If we've got somebody who's got a phenomenal back squat, but they're awful when we try and get them to do a split squat or a lunge or something like that, they just can't use the same amount of load, that's probably telling us that they're struggling with their stability in that position. So they probably need more of that split stance position to help with sprinting, change of direction, etc. But if those two are comparable, if you work out how much load would be going through the one leg in that split stance, then you probably need to just increase strength overall. And again, we can get lots of those types of movement patterns built in, unloaded normally in warm-up. So we can do lots of lunging patterns and unilateral jumping type tasks to add that in anyway. But we definitely need some unilateral in there to help get that transference in most of those sports, or split stance, not necessarily just unilateral.
Okay, perfect.
So I guess we could move on more on the part of the. I'm not sure if I can say power development at this point. I feel like it's weird to say it. So moving on the aspect of like the Olympic lifts, and their derivates, which is interesting topics. Excuse me, because every time I see like every time I read for some literature and I see like the Ancora snatch is the most speed let's say power exercise at this point, but actually every time I'll try to teach or I'll try to find athletes that are capable of doing it, basically none of them they're actually able to perform a good power snatch with the with the enough amount of weights that actually is training. So could you give us a little bit of introduction of the why is necessary or why is better, let's say that way, to train that tribal extension, and the reason why it might be more suitable for like team sport athlete to train the derivates instead of the actual lift?
Yeah, so if we look at any of those weightlifting type movements, whether it's, you know, the clean, the jerk, the snatch, power clean, power snatch, whichever variation it is, to accelerate the barbell and propel the barbell, we have to generate high forces with maximal intent. So we're aiming to do that over the shortest period of time that we can do it. And in doing so, we accelerate throughout almost the entire range of motion. So if you think about a squat down to parallel and start accelerating back up. About the first 50–55% of the range of motion, you accelerate, and then from there you decelerate. And you keep decelerating because if you didn't, you would jump. But if you're using it with a strength training load, you know, 85–90% of 1RM, you probably don't want to jump with that barbell on your back. So you naturally start to decelerate. Whereas with weightlifting exercises, we can still use high loads and we can get that rapid extension. You know, the pull to the knee from the floor is relatively slow, and then from there, the transition and the second pull is, you know, about as explosive as you can possibly make it. You're aiming to jump and get off the ground. With a heavy load, which you should be using once you're competent, you shouldn't really get off the ground. You might plantar flex, and then the barbell continues to rise up because you've imparted enough momentum on it, and then you drop underneath the bar either into a power, you know, shallow squat position to catch it, or into that full depth position. But the big benefit is that you can use high loads and accelerate through a much greater range of motion than you can when you're squatting. If you think about when you perform a counter movement jump, the depth that you squat down to, it's only a shallow squat. That's that point that you start to accelerate up from a jump is normally the point you start to decelerate in a squat. That doesn't mean that a squat isn't a good exercise. There's so much evidence out there indicating that it not only is there a strong relationship between squat strength and performance in athletic tasks, but if we increase squat performance, we increase performance in short sprints, etc. There's a really nice review and meta-analysis in sports medicine by one of Professor Greg Haft's previous PhD students, Lawrence Seitz, where he's basically put all that literature together and found, not just looking at the correlations, but if we do squats training and we increase squat strength, do we improve sprint performance? And in team sport athletes, yes, you do. So what we end up with is the squats are really effective, and the squat's probably going to be one of the best exercises to maximize your bilateral strength. But there are limitations then with how we express that force because of that deceleration during that sort of last 45% of the range of motion. And we overcome some of that, and you accelerate then through around about, depending on the load and your technique, about 95% of the range of motion, 90–95%. You start decelerating really just before you go into plantar flexion. And that's similar to what you actually observe during a jump as well. So it allows us to put in that maximum intent with a heavy load, which makes it a really useful task. The other thing to consider when we look at some of the weightlifting derivatives, and it's not that, you know, with some of the research I've done and Tim Suckermel's done, that we've not made up these exercises. They're exercises which weightlifters have used for decades, if not centuries, you know, where you'll do things like a clean pull. So you'll start on the floor, but you don't aim to catch it. You're limited with the load you use on a clean or a snatch or a power clean or a power snatch, because you have to displace the bar high enough for you to be able to drop under it and receive that bar in the correct catch position. But we can go 10, 15, 20, even up to about 40% heavier than the load we can power clean or power snatch on a clean pull. So you'll see weightlifters doing clean pulls, watch them in the warm-up room at the Olympics now, and you'll see them doing heavy clean pulls and heavy snatch pulls, 10, 15% heavier than they can actually clean or snatch. And that's a hell of a load with some of those athletes. So we can do exactly the same thing, and that way we emphasize force production even more. If we want to emphasize movement velocity rather than a clean or a snatch, if we go with a power clean or a power snatch, we have to move at higher velocities because we have to displace the bar much higher. If you think about a clean where we're catching full depth, you only have to displace the bar just above waist height to be able to drop underneath it and catch it if you've got good technique. But with a power clean, we have to displace the barbell to the sternum, so we can then drop into that shallow squat and catch it. So just by nature of those two different exercises, and a power clean is a derivative of a clean, we have to then do something slightly different and accelerate the bar to a greater extent, or get it moving at a higher velocity so it goes higher. That does mean we use a slightly lower load. So again, if we want to emphasize, if our athletes can perform all the exercises we would like them to, a more force dominant exercise would be a clean compared to a power clean, because we can lift more load on a clean compared to a power clean. But we've got a lot of athletes that can't perform a clean. I've worked with rugby players where they can't pull the bar off the floor because they haven't got the dorsiflexion to get into a safe position. So then we can put it on blocks and they might pull from the knee. And you've got others that can't get into the catch position because their shoulders are so beaten up that they can't, get in that front rack position or catch the bar above the head in a snatch. That doesn't mean that we then just say, well, let's not worry about any weightlifting derivatives or any weightlifting. We can use the variations that we're after. And as the primary goal is propulsive force production, and ideally rapid force production, then we can actually not worry about the catch. We don't necessarily need the catch. The catch may give us lots of benefits. It may allow us to, brace our trunk and brace everything to absorb that load. But bearing in mind, if you're good at weightlifting, you perform the lift, the barbell probably only goes 5 or 6 centimeters above the point that you actually catch it. So it's not like you've got a huge load dropping down on you, which you have to decelerate. You're really decelerating your mass. And there's a nice study by Mulick, which demonstrated that if you perform a power clean, I think it was at 80% of 1RM, or you do a drop jump or for a 30 or 40 centimeter box, you end up with similar forces going through your body, or you have to generate similar forces to decelerate. So, we're not using weightlifting exercises as team sport athletes or as strength and conditioning coaches to train that deceleration aspect. We'd normally do that with specific deceleration drills, with jumping tasks, etc., which are probably safer and definitely easier to do. So the weightlifting variations give us a huge range of different ways that we can actually perform these tasks, work around people's injuries or mobility, and also allow us to, if we're doing the pulling variations where we don't catch, we can add additional load. Or if you look at something like the jump shrug that Tim Suckermel first started researching, which we've done more research on recently, which is basically almost like a hang pull, but rather than stopping in full plantar flexion, you actually aim to jump. So the bar starts mid-thigh, you hinge down to the knee, and then rapidly perform that transition, triple extension, and jump, and aim to get as high in the air as you can. We can use really light loads of that. We can go sort of 30, 40% of 1RM, and we can get really, really high power outputs, high movement velocities, still getting pretty high forces. And it is a really ballistic task. Yes, you could say, well, why not just do a loaded jump? You could. But if it gives you an alternative variation for your athletes, that hinging down to the knee and performing that rapidly puts a lot of stress on the hamstrings. So if you want to target the hamstrings, that may be a good exercise, because as we hinge down, we then have to decelerate at the bottom. So it means that we've got a huge array of exercises and a large range of loading that we can use. So if it's something like a hang high pull or a jump shrug, we can use light loads, the 30, 40, 50% of 1RM or 1RM power clean. If we're doing pulling variations, to get maximum intent, we probably want to be at that top end of the range. So you probably want to be at the 80% of 1RM or higher, and we can take that right the way up to 140% of 1RM power clean. The other thing then to consider is where we start with the bar. And I mentioned a moment ago, you can start with the bar on the floor, but some people just haven't got good posture in that position, or their first pull isn't particularly good. And if we don't have a lot of time to ingrain that technique, and we've got to get some benefits out of our training, we can start by doing a hang pull or a hang power clean, or we can start at mid-thigh. Mid-thigh is easy. If you get the athlete to deadlift the barbell, and then once they're in the correct upright position with the correct grip on the bar, all they have to do is go into dorsiflexion, push your knees over your toes. It's basically like the posture you'd be in when you're sat perching on the edge of a bar stool, which a lot of athletes will know, even though they won't tell the coaches that. So you get in that sort of position with the knees pushed over the toes, upright trunk, and all you get them to do is rapidly extend hip, knees, and ankles, and that's the mid-thigh pull. If we catch the bar in a shallow squat, it's a mid-thigh power clean. If we catch it full depth, it's a mid-thigh clean. And they all have benefits. You know, if you've got an athlete that's struggling to drop underneath the bar and catch it in a clean, it's a great one to get them performing, because you don't have much time to apply force. So it sort of forces you to emphasize dropping under the bar quickly. So some of them could just be coaching tools, but they have lots of benefits for really working on that rapid force production, you know, and when we're cueing the athletes, we're telling them to be as explosive as possible, make sure you get that full extension. Now, that being said, sometimes people don't like doing the pulling variations. Some people will not put in maximum intent, and you don't even need to measure barbell velocity. You can watch them and think this person just isn't putting in a max intent, in which case give them a catching variation. Other people, though, you'll watch them catching and you're coaching them and thinking they're not reaching full extension. They're not getting anywhere near full hip and knee extension. And because they know they're about to catch it, they're dropping under the bar quickly, in which case the pulls could be a really good option. Or you can mix the two up. You can make them do 2 hang pulls, and on the third one, they catch it. And that sort of ingrains that ability to get that full extension up on their toes, pause for a second, reset, perform your second repetition, and then on the third repetition, make them catch it. And that will ingrain that sort of movement pattern of the full extension. So there's a huge range of things that we can do with these tasks. It doesn't mean everyone has to use them or should be using them, but certainly for the higher load activities, trying to move as explosively as possible, there's not really much out there like doing the heavy pulls, whether it's from the floor, from the knee, from mid-thigh. Trying to get that sort of explosive intent without that is going to be very difficult.
In my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, but we as strength conditioning coaches, we are caught up in the fact that we would like at least that our athlete will be able to perform like a power clean, a full clean, whatever. And I feel like it's just our perspective of it. Like we wish that every athlete had the technical skills to perform those kind of lifts, but at the end of the day, it's kind of impossible to pretend it. Therefore, do you think is that necessary to as a coach to know every kind of aspect of the full lift of the Olympic lifting, or is that not even necessary at this point?
I think as a coach, you've got to understand the technical aspects of all the primary exercises that you would want to use. You know, there's some stuff that you'll see out there on social media where you'll see these exercises and think, what the hell are they doing? Why are they doing that? Those ignore. But the key exercises, if you can't coach the standard exercises, you know, your front squat, back squat, split squats, hip hinging movements, plyometric tasks, ballistic jumping tasks. If you can't coach all of those things, you're probably going to struggle as a strength coach, and you probably want to be in a different profession. The weightlifting exercises you should understand. You're right, you don't have to get athletes doing all of them. You know, certainly if you're looking at things like the jump shrug and the hang high pull, if people don't like that movement pattern and they're not putting in maximum intent, give them an alternative jumping task with some load. That can be a weighted vest, it can be a barbell, it can be a hexagonal barbell, and you're still going to get a lot out of it if it's a light load. As I mentioned earlier, if you're looking at really high loads and getting that max intent, you're probably not going to get many things as good as some of those weightlifting pulling variations. And you might not, as I already mentioned, get the maximum intent if they're not catching with some athletes. But again, part of that's down to education and us making sure the athletes understand why they're performing these tasks and how it may transfer to performance. So I think as a coach, you should understand all the exercises, be able to perform them. You shouldn't be perfect at them, because we can't expect that, because we're not athletes ourselves. But you should be able to perform what looks like the task that you're coaching, because the easiest way to coach is to actually demonstrate it and get the athlete doing it. And that actually gets buy-in. And, you can look at some coaches out there that are, much older than I am, who still move phenomenally well. And they probably move that well because they do this on a daily basis. So it has huge long-term health benefits for a lot of those coaches at the same time. So yeah, I think we should be able to do all of the basic things and do them proficiently. We're not expecting a strength and conditioning coach to look like an Olympic weightlifter that we're going to see in the next few weeks at the Olympics. I certainly can't perform anywhere near as well as they can. I wish I could, even with half the load that some of them are using. But I think we've got to be able to coach it, and we've got to understand the underpinning physiology and biomechanics of those exercises, so we can make an informed decision as to why we use one exercise as opposed to another, and have the rationales for if we can't use a certain exercise with an athlete, what are all those alternatives, what are the limitations of some of those, and what are the advantages of them, so we can really give the athletes the best that they should be getting.
Perfect.
Yes, that's definitely. So moving on this topic, staying on this topic, the last question is in the regards of the youth population, because at the end of the day, if we can get athlete at, let's say, 12 years old, and that I can, and I'm quite sure to have like a good amount of time, I can invest this time in the develop those kind of skills. So would you? My initial question, but I didn't at this point. I will not say it any longer. My initial question was: should they prioritize strength or power? But it seems obvious that they have to prioritize movement part of first, and therefore strength. At this point, I would like to ask you: how an SNC, like our practitioners, should develop their program on long term in regards of power development, especially like Olympic lifts?
Well, I think it's, in terms of youth athletes, that's the best time where they don't have the same level of competitive stress there. Sometimes coaches still want them to be winning all of the time, but they don't have as long or prolonged a season, etc. So that's the time really to develop them. They're also more plastic, and you can mold them to be able to perform these exercises better. You've got to make it fun as well, though. If you're, and they shouldn't be thinking, oh my God, my coach is trying to turn me into a weightlifter, when they play a completely different sport. But you can, it's really simple, isn't it? If you think about, if you want to perform something like a hang power clean, they need to be able to front squat, because they need to be able to get into that front rack position to catch. They need to be able to do a hip hinge, so they should be able to do a stiff leg or Romanian deadlift. They need to be used to performing something with a ballistic intent. So they need some jumping type movements to get used to that rapid triple extension, or even doing mid-thigh pulls or pulls from the knee or whatever. And then you can slowly put all the pieces together, and they don't realize that they're doing it. And that could be within a session. That can be over multiple sessions, because you might emphasize strength development first, but make sure they've hit all those key postures. And then you get them focusing on the technique when we're trying to put these lifts together. One of the things to bear in mind is, because we're putting in a high level of intent, it's not always maximal, but it's a high level of intent during these exercises, even if the load's not high. As long as we're adhering to progressive overload, you could be using what would be 50% of your 1RM and performing a hang power clean, because you're just learning it. If next time you come in and you're using 52%, and then the next time you're using 54%, or you just increase the volume slightly, that's progressive overload. So we don't have to be getting the athletes at a young age to be pushing to the maximum and really, focusing on lifting as much weight as they can, especially on more technical exercises. We need to make sure they can perform all the movements safely and competently, and safely and competently with load as well. It's no good just using, a broom handle, a wooden dowel or something. We need to give them some load, but it needs to be progressive, and it needs to be managed in the right way. If we do that, and if we did a really good job of that with all our athletes, if we're training them then as senior athletes, we would be able to choose whatever exercise is best for them with minimal restrictions. That's not the case. But I think if we're focusing on youth athletes, getting that underpinning strength and the movement qualities is ideal, and then slowly building up and giving them challenges. Sometimes you might just throw in things like weightlifting type exercises because it's a challenge for their motor skills. It's a different type of task they're doing. They might be getting a little bit bored with the traditional sort of exercises you're doing. And that's the one thing to bear in mind, is it should always be fun. You don't want them turning up to, your gym-based training session thinking, oh, here we go again. It's going to be squats again. It's going to be deadlifts again. We want them to turn up thinking, right, what are we doing tonight? Because they really want to get stuck into it. So that's key, but it should be relatively easy to program and plan over, a season for an athlete, whatever age. And then at the end of that season, you can reevaluate that. And I know a lot of, professional academy squads will be in a setup where it's right, this is what we expect between the ages of 13 and 14. This is what we expect between 14 and 15, 15 and 16. But actually, sometimes you can accelerate them far more rapidly than that because they learn quickly. So yes, we need to develop movement competency. Then we need to keep it fun. We need to increase force production. It's probably not going to be maximum strength training, but we're going to be progressively increasing load if we're focusing on strength. There will be some power training in there. The one thing to bear in mind is people don't have a problem with young athletes doing jumping training, plyometric type training, etc. They're generally not conditioned to do that. And generally their movement patterns aren't particularly good. We need to build up those movement patterns, but it shouldn't be high intensity plyometrics until you're conditioned appropriately to perform those tasks. But people aren't worried about seeing young athletes perform those tasks because there's no external load. They jump off a table or a box, whatever it might be, 50 centimeters in the air. It doesn't look like it's a challenging task. Make them do that onto a force plate, and you can see just how challenging it is from the grain reaction forces. Again, running, you're getting 2.5 to 3 times body weight as a grain reaction force when you're running. Nobody worries about them running, X distance. Put a 20 kilo barbell on a 10-year-old shoulders and people start to worry. So it's about educating the parents, the coaches, and actually making sure we develop the physical capacities in that sort of planned and periodized and sequenced manner. So if we want some high intensity plyometrics in our athletes training program when they're, say, 16, we've appropriately conditioned them so that they can perform those safely, so that their muscles and tendons have strengthened to the extent that we want them to be, so we can really get them rebounding as we would like them to, and that they've done all the sort of lower level activities prior to that. So it really is about thinking about that long-term athlete development for those athletes. But as I said earlier, sometimes that's your senior athlete. That athlete can come into your squad at the age of 19 or 20 and have done none of that, whereas you might have 10 players that have been doing that for the last 9 or 10 years. So that same approach is true for athletes with a very low training age. And I'm referring to sort of gym training age. They might have been playing the sport for the last 15 years. But if they've done no structured strength training, we've got to treat them as a real novice with that type of training. So it's just about, taking a step back sometimes and thinking, right, let's be a little bit conservative to start with, and let's progress this athlete at the rate that they can progress. If you've got a squad of 30 youth athletes, age 12, 13 years old, you can't individualize it too much. There just isn't the time or the manpower normally, but you'll still have something where you bring them along at a steady, progressive and sequenced rate.
Yeah, definitely. Also because there's this misconception about the actual load that you can put on the back of the child. But as you said, like there's a lot of, you mentioned the importance of the intent, and also good amount, let's say a good amount of studies nowadays that are actually saying that the intent maybe is one of the most important thing, because it doesn't really matter how much load you get on the bar, but how you wanna propel it or use it. Let's put it in this way, which is more important rather than the actual weight. So yes, definitely. And also because as you said, like that's precisely the concept of the peak high velocity. So you get like this window where they're perfect for loading. So why not?
Yeah, definitely. And the difficulty with that is you've got a group of 13, 14-year-old boys, and they're all at totally different stages, which makes it tricky. And they also have that period where, they're like an adolescent, like a newborn giraffe, and they can't coordinate their limbs. That doesn't happen with everyone. You know, some people, you don't notice them go through that. Others, you really do see it. So we've also got to plan for that. And if we see that happening with an athlete and coordination is deteriorating, we have to, you know, ease back and do, you know, far less complex tasks for them, which they can then manage for that period and then reintroduce the more complex ones later. And I think that, you know, the point you just mentioned about people being concerned about the amount you load the skeletal system with a barbell on the back, etc. Actually, there's numerous studies out there indicating that people that do proper resistance training as youths have a much higher bone density later on. As long as it's well structured and progressive, etc., you know, there's minimal injuries that come to the skeletal system from that type of exercise. I think the highest incidence of skeletal injuries is from horse riding, from the impact you can get while you're riding or when you fall off the horse. You know, but it shouldn't be a concern as long as it is progressive and that you're loading them in the appropriate manner. But again, that goes back to the point of having appropriately skilled and qualified staff that understand this. The problem is some of the best staff that work with those athletes want to progress up and go and work with the senior team because there's far more money. Maybe we should be paying our coaches that work with the youth athletes more money than we are paying them to keep them there, because, and some clubs do that very, very well. But, you know, they're the ones that we really need to make an impact on. Once your athletes are, you know, in the senior squad, there's far less you can normally achieve with them at that point, especially if they are earning a lot of money, because sometimes it's, look, I've made it. And they don't have that same desire and drive to try and do better. Whereas if you're a 14, 15, 16-year-old wanting that professional contract in your sport, whatever that sport is, and whenever you turn professional, you're going to be training really, really hard. You'll want to do everything you can. I'll admit I've seen that sometimes with athletes towards the end of their career that are saying, look, you know, I'm getting a bit old for playing rugby league or rugby union. What can I do to make myself better, more robust, so that I don't get injured, so I'm not damaged as much at the end of a game as I normally am? So again, you do get either end of that continuum, and sometimes that's just because they love the sport. But the drive and the desire is, you know, with some youth athletes, it's phenomenal. And then they really are in a good place to learn all these exercises, whatever the exercises might be. And that could just be plyometric tasks, whatever it might be. You need to almost make those athletes as enthusiastic about the training you're doing with them is what they do in their sport, because they know it's going to benefit them in their sport, and they'll become better and better at their sport.